What makes a visionary? For some, it's the passion for innovation. For others, it's seeing opportunities to make a difference when others have given up. This week on Full Frame, conversations with visionaries who are using their global fame to make an impact. I'm Mike Walter, coming to you from the heart of New York City's vibrant Times Square. Let's take it full frame. Our first guest is an Academy Award-winning actress whose starring roles in films like Dead Man Walking, Thelma and Louise, The Client, and the Rocky Horror Picture Show have demonstrated her range and versatility and cemented her place in pop culture. Take a look.
The Rocky Horror Picture Show.
This is my fiancée, Janet Weiss.
Touch me. I wanna be dirty.
Take a deep breath. Let it all out. Now we're going to pick up our instruments. And when I count to 4, we're going to play the shit out of this thing. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Boys, shoot the radio. The police radio, Louise.
Got it. You boys attempted to interrogate a child outside the presence of his mother without her consent. If I need anything from you boys, like the truth, well, I expect to get it.
Blame the government, you blame drugs, you blame blacks. What about Matthew Poncelet? What, is he just an innocent?
If you do die, as your friend, I want to help you die with dignity, and I don't see how you can do that unless you start to own up to the part you played in Walter and Hope's death. You want to take a 12-year-old girl to a Pearl Jam concert on a school night?
Just thought it would be something nice that she and I could do together.
It's ridiculous.
Of course Jackie's going to be hostile, irrational.
Pearl Jam? Yeah. On a school night?
Mm-hmm. We are going out.
Oh, Mom.
In addition to her work in front of and behind the camera, Susan Sarandon is also an activist and humanitarian. She dedicates her time and resources to advocate for social and political justice. She's an outspoken voice on issues such as capital punishment, world hunger, HIV and AIDS awareness, and LGBTQ rights. She served as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and Goodwill Ambassador for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. She recently shifted her focus to helping those affected by the devastating earthquake in Nepal. More than 9,000 people died in April of 2015, and those who survived, they are still struggling. Susan Sarandon saw that firsthand as she volunteered with Live to Love International. She was on the ground with the Nepalese people and hopes to encourage tourists from around the world to visit that beautiful nation. She's here to talk about her illustrious career, her recent work in Nepal. We want to welcome Susan Sarandon to the show.
Thank you.
Do you feel like your life just flashed before you?
Yeah, I feel like I should lose weight, too. I'm looking at...
You know what's amazing is we talked about your range, and I'm not a stalker, but it just so happened I was flipping across the TV the last 2 weeks, and I knew I was going to be interviewing you. I saw you in The Calling as a police detective, and then I saw you as this grandmother in Tammy, and I'm just amazed at all these different roles. I mean, is it serendipity, or are you
I did 3 alcoholics in a row that summer. Tammy and The Calling were one of them, and I forget which the other one was. Well, you choose from what you're offered, and I don't like to repeat myself, and, you know, things change year to year what you're offered, and, yeah. I mean, I see myself as a character actor, so I like to do different things. I'm not really a very interesting personality, so I don't, you know, there's some actors that just play themselves and do that very well, and then there are other people that are more character actors, and I'm kind of that.
You know, I had the opportunity to interview Gina Davis last year, and she talked about Thelma and Louise, and that people still come up and say stuff to her. And the great thing about having great roles, it's almost like a comet with the tail. I mean, you were telling us when the clips were running that you still run into some of the band players. Now they're all grown up in that one scene. Do you think about that when you're in a role that, geez, this thing's going to be around for so long, and I'm still going to be stopped about it? And you must still
If only you knew which movies were going to turn out to be around for a while. I mean, thanks to Ridley Scott, I mean, Thelma and Louise, he put us in a very heroic kind of setting, and made a great movie, and it lasted. But there are great parts that are in mediocre films, or there are good little films that the studio doesn't support, and so they disappear, and then people find them later. So I think you learn pretty soon, pretty early on in a career, to invest in this business, in the doing of it, and let go of what happens to it, because you have no control over it, and there's, you know, it's just like the rest of the world, there's no justice. So you never know. You know, you can have a really great script and it could get ruined by the music they put in, or the editor isn't funny. You can have a mediocre script that, you know, gets better. That doesn't happen too often, but so you don't know, I don't think. And you certainly, I mean, I've been very lucky in that, or strangely Zelig-like, in that quite a few of my films have had some kind of social, I don't know, turning point where they became something that meant something at that particular time. And so that helps them also stay around. But certainly when we did the Rocky Horror Show for $1 million, nobody thought it would be resurrected a number of years later and still be around as the longest running film. You know, and Thelma and Louise, we thought we were making a little cowboy movie with girls and trucks, and didn't understand that people would be so offended. Pretty Baby, I had no idea that would end up doing what it did. And Dead Man Walking, we were just so happy to find a way to do it. And then when people actually sat through that, to the tune of over $100 million, that's a difficult film.
Yeah.
And the fact that it changed the dialogue, I mean, we hoped it would make the conversation about the death penalty more real for both sides, but we had no idea it would be economically, you know, a success at all. And Tim did a brilliant job with that, and with the script, and, you know. But no, you don't know. I think you just do it because you love it, and you try to find adventure and challenge in every part that you do. And you know, now I mean, I did a movie recently where I didn't have to die or help someone die. That was really refreshing, because you get to a certain age and suddenly, you know, everything changes. So I was surprised to be off finding those scripts, you know, where there was a romance and still.
But it's got to be a great feeling to work on something that you're passionate about, and the issue's so important. And given the fact that you know about the ebbs and flows, you just never know, and then for it to be such a huge
I think every film
success.
is political. Every film either reinforces sexism, ageism, racism, or challenges it. And you don't notice the ones that support the status quo, you notice the ones that challenge it. But every film puts an audience into some place where they're, you know, looking at their lives, and anything for me that encourages an audience member to be the protagonist in their own life, that's what gets me excited. And so if I can find that, and it's something that I haven't done before, you never know. There's so many, you know, you never know what the director's going to do. I think I was in George Roy Hill's Only Bomb with Robert Redford, the great Waldo Pepper. So you know, you just never know. As I said, it trains you not to care about the success of what happens later, and to do it for the sake of doing it. And so if you're not passionate about playing that person, if it doesn't scare you a little bit, then I think you shouldn't do it.
You're also a ping pong player, and of course our audience loves the fact ping pong diplomacy, big huge step between China and the United States. What is it about the sport that you love? Well,
first let me say I'm more of a propagandist than a player. I'm not that great. I mean, there's a rumor that I'm great, and we'll keep that going, but I'm really not that great. First of all, little girls can beat their dads. I mean, it cuts across body type, it cuts across age. It's something you can play forever. It's not expensive. Just about everybody has had some experience playing ping pong. The learning curve is very quick up to a certain point. So, you know, the clubs that we have Spin, which is franchising now all over, you know, you can go and not just drink, and you have something to do on a date. You have something you can do with your family. But I love the fact that it's, you know, if you really decide to be very good, that it doesn't matter if you're a big muscle-bound guy. And we've been giving tables to the schools, the underserved schools in New York, and it's now a scholastic sport in 40-some schools, so you can actually get credit. And they were telling me when I gave one of the donations recently that 95% of the kids that join the ping pong club, or whatever it's called, have never joined anything before. So I think it's great because it is kind of a solitary thing. I mean, you play face to face, which is what's great for dating. You don't have to wear someone else's shoes. And at Spin we have food and music, and so you can kind of fool around, and then if you want to be serious, you can come back and be competitive. But I think the game itself is very it's a Olympic sport. It's not underrated, but a lot of people thought it was just so weird and that only dorky kids did it. But now that all the dorky kids are ruling the world, I think, and we've made it sexy, and now you can play and not be in the closet about it.
What is it about that passion? I mean, how do people connect with that passion in you? And you have, it's varied. I mean, it's not just
Look, in the business I'm in, you use your imagination. If you use your imagination, then that leads to empathy. And once you can imagine what it would be like to send your kid off to war, then you empathize with the mother that's being asked to do that. So it's a natural progression. And as somebody who, I use the term artist very lightly, anybody that's in a creative pursuit is outside anyway. We're kind of outsiders, really. I don't care how much you try to pretend you're in the middle of things. It's your job, I think, to observe and to give people an opportunity to reframe their lives and get information. And it's the kind of business that can really use you, so I prefer to use it rather than be used. And though I'm not really an expert on anything, it gives me the opportunity to just shine a little light or give a little voice, like today, to people that maybe aren't as media connected. And I find that, you know, people have such open hearts and they're so generous and really want to know, but they're just not given the opportunity. Most of the news is corporately owned and not particularly interesting and kind of on a loop. And so there's a lot of little stories that get lost, and that's why we drag up all these old celebrities at the UN or wherever, just to be able to put a focus on an issue that it wasn't getting traction before. And unfortunately, that's the way it works these days, so that's what we do.
We all saw the imagery, that this horrendous event in Nepal. But a lot of us are kind of, we watch it, we feel paralyzed, but that's not you. I mean, you went there. Talk to me about going, what you expected to see, what you saw, and what does that do to your psyche?
Well, I'd never been to Nepal before. I actually had a trip planned, and the earthquake had hit 2 days before. It's a long way to go. It's not easy for everybody, and honestly, you know, everyone can't just pick up and go and be helpful. Sometimes if you show up in a disaster area in the United States, if you can't provide a service, you're more of a problem if you're another mouth to feed and shelter. So you have to be able to make sure that if you are going to go somewhere, what your job is and if you can help. In this case, I have friends that are there. His Holiness and Live to Love is one group, and then Pushpa Basnet, who I had nominated for the CNN Heroine, who won and had built an orphanage, and she takes these kids out of prison, because in Nepal, if you go to prison, your kids go with you if they don't have anywhere to go. And so her house collapsed and her kids were in a field, and I was very concerned, and His Holiness arranged for me to go, and the nuns protected me, and I had a great stay and could go up and help deliver rice and oil and baby food up in the hills, and also see. And the other part of my mission was to show people that everything hadn't fallen down. I mean, there's still such beautiful temples, and Nepal is such an extraordinary country. I mean, there's very few countries that you can go to that have so much history and are so beautiful, and when the monsoons end, they'll be ready to have people come. And so part of it was to, because the clips that we were getting, I didn't expect to see anything standing. I mean, we just kept seeing the same buildings falling over and over, right? So I think I was worried about, you know, how dangerous. People didn't want me to go because well, the whole time we were there were still aftershocks the entire time, 4 and 5 something, you know, but this was right at the beginning. When my son went after, Jack Henry went after I came back to help Pushpa, and he didn't experience any aftershocks, so I think it's, you know, it's calmed down. But I saw an amazing resilience of spirit. I mean, people are having to take the bricks from their houses that haven't completely fallen down and take the cement off them and pile them and rebuild, and it's just, you know, it's a big deal. But I was happy to know what I could do if it meant, you know, to Skype from there and to really just bring the message back that Nepal is still worth traveling to, and that they're going to survive, and that you know, we've gotten some grants for Pushpa, so we're trying to rebuild, and just to give a hand to sing with the kids and play with the kids. And I brought chalk, and so we got donations of health food bars, and my son brought boots the next time. And we were just, because just to get things to people was very difficult. So we were also carrying as much as we could to help immediately.
Well, getting stuff to people is still a bit of an issue. Live to Love, very much involved with that. You're very much involved with them. Carrie Lee from Live to Love is going to join us right after this short break, and we'll continue our conversation about the latest efforts to rebuild Nepal. I want to welcome you back to Full Frame. Susan loves our music, by the way. And joining us now is Carrie Lee. She's with Live to Love International. And so the two of these, obviously connected, know a great deal about what's going on in Nepal. We're going to continue our conversation about a country that was really hit hard, hammered by this earthquake. And Carrie, I know that your people are still on the ground there, yes, still intense. Kind of give us an update, because Susan makes a really good point. You know, this news cycle, it's 24 hours. Unless it's Caitlyn Jenner, and then it seems like it goes on for forever, and this important stuff tends to kind of go by the wayside. Give us an idea of a scene setter, if you will, of what's going on right now.
Absolutely, and first of all, thank you to Full Frame and Susan for keeping a spotlight on Nepal. It's probably the most important thing for us in this development of relief work. And Susan, who has done movies about helping people die, well, she's done a lot of work on helping people live in Nepal, so that's greatly appreciated. On the ground now is monsoon season. We Live to Love focuses on particular communities where there are a lot of migrant workers. A good chunk of Nepal's population goes abroad for work, leaving women, children, and the elderly to cope with recovery. So those are the communities that we focus on. Once monsoon season is over, and I think Nepal, I'm pretty convinced that Nepal is ready to take on tourists. You know, we're first responders at one point, and now we're sort of coping with monsoon season and making sure that there isn't widespread disease and getting everyone sheltered and building up. And by the time monsoon season is over, we'll be ready for tourism.
Let me ask both of you, and Susan, maybe you can take first crack at this. It seems to me the story is always the battered. You know, they're battered. And I think the one story that often is missing, and I'm sure you saw it firsthand, is the resiliency of people when they're dealing with something like this. So what were some of the takeaways for you?
Well, you see people sharing. I mean, when we went up into the hills, the nuns were so organized, and they had everyone's names, and so we were meeting with all these people, and they were taking care of each other and finding the people that weren't there. So I think there's a lot of cooperation. You did see a lot of women and children. I think that, you know, so that whatever the males were in the village that were still around, or the young guys that hadn't gone off to work, were helping taking care of, you know, some of the older people. But I see it in the kids, too. You know, I see how much they respond to the love that Pushpa gives them, even though they've had very difficult beginnings, and even though they've had a very difficult time surviving and have a bit of a stigma on them. They're very resilient, and I think that there have been so many plans. I mean, His Holiness came up very quickly. They were coming up with not just a plan, but actual tin roofs and things to build, to rebuild, and how they would shelter these people, because the pressure was knowing that the monsoons were coming. So, I mean, it wasn't as if it was total chaos. You know, there was a lot of need and there was a lot of devastation, but there were also a lot of minds that were figuring things out.
Yeah, and the strength of the people. I mean, you must have seen that as well. I mean, and you have people on the ground who see it every day, I'm sure.
That's absolutely right. They're survivors. You know, the Himalayas is been critical to stabilizing that region, and it's often overlooked. And the Nepali people have given so much to the rest of the world in terms of culture and tradition and art. And now it's time, I think, that people give back to Nepal.
And I've talked to people, you know, shortly after the devastation about what it's like to come into an area that's been devastated by a huge earthquake or a tsunami or whatever. And that rebuilding stage is so lengthy. And as you said, the spotlight goes off. Any idea how long it's going to take for Nepal to get back up on its feet? Because this person was saying one of the things that you hope for anytime you go into a situation like that is a really strong infrastructure. And in Nepal, it's not as strong as you'd like. So I'm sure that adds to the layers of complexity. So what was your sense coming away, Susan?
Well, I think, you know, I think that there are a lot of individual groups that are helping in very real ways. I mean, look how long it took us to deal with Ground Zero. And that was bureaucracy and some corruption and everything else, you know. And what I saw there was that the difference was made by individuals who were going out. When I was down there for months and months, there were individuals going out and getting pizzas and, you know, before anything could come in. And I think that that's the strength of Nepal also, is that they're not waiting for the top to come and do it. There are all these on-the-ground people that have very quickly and very efficiently found ways to deal and to build. And like I said, you know, one of my jobs was shopping. I took the nuns shopping to go to these really cool little crafty places and stuff, because we wanted people to see that there's a lot that's still up. It's not, there's hotels and there are restaurants, and, you know, there was a lot of devastation, and we can't minimize that, and there is a great need for money to keep coming in, but it's also, it's important not to just write it off.
You know, I think Susan's hitting on something that's really important, and we saw this with Haiti, where, you know, these big institutions come in and they're going to do everything. It really takes the people, it takes this collaboration for it to work right.
But even in Haiti, like, the money didn't get spent by a lot of these big groups.
Yeah.
And Artists for Peace and Justice that I work with in Haiti built a high school over the years since the earthquake, and have gotten in there and done things. And again, it's, you know, you can't go into a place, anytime you're trying to do help, you have to have a really good relationship with the people that live there. You have to understand the culture.
Exactly.
You have to understand how to get things to them, not only physically, but psychologically. You know, you can't just go in and be big and bulky, and then I find that there's, you know, I saw one of the big agencies that I won't mention, but they were staying in the best hotel. They were all eating these great lunches while everyone else was scurrying around in Nepal. And so I always say, if you want to help, find the groups that are in there that have the history, and see what they do, and investigate where you're putting your money. And that's why I stand behind this group and Pushpa, because I know, you know, there's not a lot of overhead. I know that they know what they're doing. I know that the money goes there. And that's really important if you want to help.
And one of the things you're advocating is tourism. I mean, you know, like, and Carrie, you had a chance to chat with me about this too. I mean, yes, it's hit, but as you mentioned, you know, hotels are still there. It's a good time to go back. That's the lifeblood of that country in many respects. It's really important that people support it in that way as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you see this as critical as well?
I do. You know, it's not just about getting first aid. It's not just about rebuilding buildings. It's about empowering the people to have a livelihood, and empowering the economies that need to be jump-started again. And this is a great opportunity also to empower women and children who haven't had economic opportunities before, to be able to have a fresh start and partake in the new economies that are going to rise.
Yeah,
come back even stronger.
Yeah, come back in a different way than there's been, and actually see this as a rebirth of new ideas and better ideas. You know, sometimes when things have to fall apart to be rebuilt in a more interesting way, at least that's what I'm hoping as I look at everything falling apart. And here too, that it gives you a chance to regroup, to reboot, to rethink. And that's a great point, that you can start all these little industries for women, and that have been so successful in so many countries.
Susan knows how to sift through and find organizations like yours. What's your suggestion to people out there who may be watching and want to actually connect with the right kind of organization?
You know, I believe in investing in NGOs that are flexible on the ground and that are already part of the indigenous fabric. So Live to Love has been in Nepal since inception. We're a big part of the Himalayan community. You can learn more about us at livetolove.org, but also keeping the spotlight on Nepal, keeping engaged in what's going on, and keeping the awareness wheel going is very important.
And Susan, you gave, you went, you were there, you were on the ground, but you get as well when you leave there. What are some of the takeaways, the lasting images or things that stay with you?
Well, first of all, I'm moved by everybody that helps. I'm moved by the way the communities bond together. I'm moved by Pushpa and the kids and how, you know, in the face of everything else, these kids are so hopeful. It's so easy in the world today to lose faith because the stories that get all of the heat are horrible stories and the worst of humankind and the worst of greed and selfishness and everything else. And so when you go to a place and you see people, and it's funny because, for instance, in New York, and I'm a born and bred New Yorker, the same people that you see building houses for Habitat and Humanity were down at ground zero. I mean, it's the community of bad guys is all the same and the community of good guys is all the same. And I think that really it's so selfish to get involved in these things because it gives you hope at a time when that's really difficult to have sometimes when you pick up the paper and everything's so overwhelming. And so I came back just feeling like I'd been to a different world where I wasn't so important and people were giving everything they had and joyfully. You know, I think the misconception that people have about do-gooders, every country I've ever been in, they're just the most passionate, happiest, most celebratory. I mean, His Holiness is laughing all the time in the face of everything. And so something must fill you up from having a connection, a passionate connection with your country, with something that you believe in, and with being able to see that you affect even one life, you know, turn someone around and give them options that they never would have had, with just a little bit of money too, or just a little bit of time to empower these people that are doing it the real way. I mean, I'm just a little dilettante compared to what people that really dig in and do these things all the time. But I left feeling empowered. I left feeling grateful that I could be part of it, just being very, very grateful for all the support that the nuns, my posse, the nuns were great. These young women that just glow because they're connected to what they want to be connected to, and of course His Holiness and Pushpa and the kids. So I came back. I hadn't slept at all. I was completely turned around. Seriously, I was on the verge of hallucinations, I think, but I never slept and I never felt tired. I really just, you know, it's a big trip and you're completely in the wrong day or something, and 15 minutes, like it's a day and 15 minutes or something crazy.
Well, I just saw the Kung Fu nuns yesterday, and by way of background, Live to Love has on-ground partners. We call them unofficially the Kung Fu nuns. They're the nuns of the Drukpa order, and traditionally in the Himalayan region, nuns were subservient to men and didn't have much of a leadership role. His Holiness the Gyalwang Drukpa, who Susan has been referring to, decided to empower these women to take leadership roles, and unfortunately more conservative pockets were quite upset, and these nuns bear the brunt of a lot of acts of violence. His Holiness the Gyalwang Drukpa thought long and hard on what to do and whether it was time to back down, but decided instead to train these nuns in the art of Kung Fu, which also gave them a lot of physical self-confidence. And now they're local role models in their villages and communities. They've traveled the world and did demonstrations at Olympic Park, at Oxford University. But the great part was they've now, since the lineage and His Holiness and the community invested in empowering these nuns and giving them a sense of confidence, they felt strong enough to be first responders, and they're the ones that are river rafting supplies to the most remote villages. And it's a great example of what women can do in this region. They've been traditionally overlooked, and now they're paying it forward.
Well, we've got two great women here growing that community of good guys, and it's good to see. And thank you both for coming on and sharing your stories. Really appreciate it. Coming up next, we'll meet another female visionary working to make a global impact. The American magazine People calls her, quote, the most famous woman in China, while Time magazine proclaimed her the queen of the Middle Kingdom. Chinese-American Yu Sai-Khan is an award-winning television host and producer, fashion icon, best-selling author, humanitarian, and successful entrepreneur. She's been a figure in both Chinese and American media for decades. She produced and hosted the Chinese series One World, making her the first American to host a TV show in China. That made her a household name in the country. Shortly after, she launched her own cosmetics brand, the first foreign-owned makeup company in all of China. It soon became the leading cosmetic company in the country. In 2001, UNICEF named her its first and only Chinese-American Say Yes ambassador for children. She's also dedicated to several Chinese nonprofit organizations, which are committed to the betterment and advancement of women and children. And she's launched her own initiative to build schools, libraries, and award scholarships to outstanding underprivileged students. Joining us now to share more about her remarkable cross-cultural life is Yu Sai-Khan, and welcome to Full Frame.
Hi, Michael.
So tell me about your childhood. I get the sense that art was a big part of it. Tell me about growing up and whether or not that contributed to who you are today, you think.
I'm sure that childhood is very important for just about anybody. My mom was never a really artist, but my father was. Mom was an enabler for artists. My mom was very supportive of my father, and when I wanted to play the piano, for example, she would drive me to the school, to the class every day. I mean, she would arrange for the piano lessons and everything. So in a way, you know, my mom was most instrumental in helping us to become very artistic, but my father was a true artist and a true gentleman. You know, he's a typical Chinese gentleman. He, for example, he played the erhu, which is a Chinese instrument. My father paints beautifully. He was a calligrapher. So we grew up when we were little, just with a lot of art in our family. We had the piano first before we had a TV. Oh, wow. So it was really fun. And I remember we used to have his paintings all over the house. So having paintings in the bathroom is a normal thing for us, you know. And in China, you don't see that actually. So we feel very privileged that we grew up in such a family.
So you start there, and then at some point you enter a beauty pageant. So it's not just art, it's art and beauty, which is why you are who you are today, I guess, in a sense. Tell me how that changed you.
Well, I was in college in Hawaii at BYU. And one day they came to me and said the school voted you to represent the university to run in a beauty pageant. Some beauty pageant. I was 19 years old. I was, you know, clueless. In those days, I was a clueless 19-year-old. Okay, we had no internet, no nothing, and of course, you know, as typically a girl grew up in a Chinese kind of family, my mom never thinks that a girl being beautiful is an important thing. You know, we never even thought of that. So when I entered the contest for the university, it was the first time I got in touch with somebody who actually taught me how to use makeup. Wow, I said, this is magical. I can change the way I look by using merely a lipstick or eyeshadow, you know, to change. If I don't like my nose, I can make it differently, you know. I mean, it's just magical. I think it has a lot to do with later on the fascination I have with cosmetics. And then, of course, when you're being trained for beauty pageant, they teach you how to face the camera, how do you answer a question, you know, even difficult questions. And as a young woman, I really was very very impressed by this whole entire experience. So I think it had a lot to do with what I did in the future in television. And if I didn't have that beauty pageant experience, I probably never would have had my careers afterwards.
Yeah, they're all kind of building blocks along the way in a sense. So tell me about going into TV, and the interesting thing is that you have been able to bridge this which is astonishing in a sense, in that you've been able to capture an American audience and a Chinese audience. There's very few that claim to do that. So tell me about entering TV. How did that come about? And was it just happenstance, or was this goal-oriented? I'm going to go on TV's next? Or?
No goal-oriented. A friend of mine came to me and said he was starting the first Chinese language cable show, in those days cable show, and in Chinese. And he said, can you come in for a day every every week, and I'd like you to interview some people and do simultaneous translation and read some news for me and all that. And I said, that sounds like a lot of fun, you know, and I took it very, very lightly, but I did give a day of my life in those 2 years. And I must tell you, there was a lot of fun. You know, television is a lot of fun. You know, before you and I do this interview, it didn't exist, right? Our talk did not exist. But we are now creating a story where I think that maybe, hopefully, millions of people will see. So to me, it was just a fascinating process. So it got me so fascinated that I decided that I'm going to just really do it. And besides, when I was doing that volunteer job, I would do a show on Qigong, and the phone would ring off the hook, and I would do a program about how the Chinese would celebrate a Chinese New Year, all the dishes and all that. People would ring off the hook. So I knew that there was a group of Americans in America who were very, very interested in Asia, and yet there was absolutely no place where they get that information. So I started a show called Looking East, and that show, and later on we filmed all over Asia. And it was actually really the forerunner of Anthony Bourdain, you know.
Yeah, right. So tell me about Looking East. I mean, was it a hard sell? I mean,
no. It was, of course, everything, as you know, is hard. And there's nothing easy about doing anything, actually, because you have to find, I was the boss, and I had to find the cameraman, I had to find sponsors, I have to do all of that by myself, because it's a small little company. So it was not so very easy. The hardest thing is when we went around the country, around the world, you know, really to do local shooting. That's you know, is hard, because, you know, especially when I started shooting for One World and went all over the country, the language is a problem, you know, and financing is a problem. It's hard. It's not easy.
So you had mentioned you were a clueless 19-year-old. Do you think you were clueless when you entered the TV business, if you knew how difficult it was going to be?
Totally. But actually, what was encouraging is that I got a phone call from Mike Wallace, and he said to me, he said, you know, by circumstance, by happenstance, I saw you on television and interviewing an expert on nichige, you know, the Japanese, you know, the carving, and he said it was fabulous. He said it was, and I was so stunned, you know, that was Mike Wallace, and I said, Mike, can you do me a favor? Give me that in writing so I can put it in our material, and he did. He said, Yusa is an unsung glory on television. You know, wow. I said that was really it was very encouraging. I enjoyed television only because it is again, you know, it's a magical media. You know, it actually makes things happen, you know, at that moment. But the key really is producing both for China and United States the difficulty is that I need to make sure that I know exactly what the American audience wants. And I also have to know really what the Chinese audience wants. And if I know that clearly, then I can prepare the programs. If I don't know, the biggest problem sometimes is that the people don't know the cultures well enough.
Right. Well, they want different things, don't they? The U.S. audience, and there's probably some similarities, but there's probably differences too.
Yes, absolutely. You know, and that's where the communication sometimes breaks down, because some of those translations are different, you know, and the mindset is different.
Do you think you had a sixth sense going in of what the audiences wanted, or
no.
was it something that evolved over time?
Well, for example, when I was doing Looking East, I know American culture very well. I've lived here for many years, so, and I happen to know the Eastern culture. So I was able to say, oh, well, this would be very interesting for the Americans. So that was a big help, no? And when I was producing for China, the same thing happens. I said, you know, I know what the Chinese people want to hear, and I know I can produce that for them.
You've had such an amazing trajectory, and yet one of the things I think is interesting, before the broadcast here we were chatting, you just went to the state dinner and you sat next to Henry Kissinger. And I'm just thinking, without Henry Kissinger and
Yes.
Richard Nixon, your life would have been entirely different.
Yours
And-
too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And here you were sitting next to this man who in many ways opened so many doors to you and really created this rich life. Did you talk to him about it at all?
Yes, of course. I've interviewed Henry Kissinger twice, and we've done a number of things together. I see him all the time. And in fact, he has incredible memory even at this juncture. You look at him, he's sort of a little bit slower, and you know, it's just sort of stoopy. But he was very alert. You know, when Obama came over to talk to us, Obama was actually asking him for his opinion about something. So Kissinger is an extraordinary person even today, and he reminded me a few days after the state dinner when I saw him again. He said, "Didn't we like Neo, you know, the performer?" And I thought, wow, this guy really had an amazing, and he said, "Wasn't that a great dinner we had? Was it great?" It was wonderful. And he said to me, he said, "You know, Obama hates state dinners." He said to me, he said, I've gone to hundreds of state dinners," he said, "all through the years. And you know that Obama really does not like state dinners." He said, I was laughing. I said, if I were Obama, I wouldn't either, because he has to shake 200 pairs of hands. And who the hell wants to do that, right?
It's a good point. One of the things I want to talk to you about is cultural dialogue and communication, you know, this bridge concept again. One of the things I think is really interesting about the Chinese president, President Xi, of course, years ago went to Muscatine, Iowa, had this amazing experience, doesn't have the language, but still has this connection. And he's, of course, pushing a lot of that, the back and forth. In Muscatine, they have pictures of him everywhere. I mean, you know, this little town in Iowa, they're in love with China and the Chinese president. Talk to me about opening that door, because you've been successful at that, and cultural dialogue, the back and forth. How important is it? How much more needs to happen?
Oh, a lot more.
Yeah.
A lot more. I think that still Americans know very little about China. I was talking to the Chinese consul general here, and this brilliant woman, I said, "What is the most difficult thing for you?" She says, "Most difficult is to make Americans understand China." Because there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of fear about the power of China today, and it's a lot of misgiving. I think that a lot has to do with the fact that they don't really travel between each other that much. You know, if you take a trip to China and you see it for yourself, what China is all about, and you are connecting with the real Chinese, you know firsthand what it is happening, what is happening there, and what they are really like. The same thing as coming to United States. You know, I see a lot of negative things in the social media. There's some Chinese say terrible things about you know, Americans. I said, I wish they could come here, speak the language, and understand what they really are. It's wonderful people. Truly, Americans are wonderful people.
And the same is true of the Chinese.
Exactly.
I mean, and it really is, it's frustrating. I mean, imagine it must be more frustrating for you, because you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. But sometimes I sit there and I talk to people, I'm like, what planet are you on? I mean, the ignorance level, and it gets to the heart of what you're saying. I mean, if you travel there and really see the country, which I've had the good fortune of, and you have as well, there's so many similarities. There's not as many dissimilarities.
Well, President Xi Jinping said something really that I remember very well during the state dinner. He said, you know, we have a lot of things in common, America and China, and yet we also have many things that are not, we don't see eye to eye. But we must have a very, we must have an open mind about the things that we are not in agreement with, and try to resolve these agreements so that when one adds one, it is more than two. I thought that was just the most impressive thing. You know, it was exactly, I think, how he feels about our relationship. And if we can take that as an example of how we should look at our differences between U.S. and America, I think we would do very well, much better actually.
You were mentioning to me that you're very involved in charity work.
Yes.
You just did an event, I think you were saying, with Brent Scrokoff here in the U.S. But you do it in the U.S. and China. So I want to ask you about what are the differences there in terms of doing charity work in both countries?
Oh, well, charity by itself is really something very new in China. America is a giving country. It's one of the most generous countries I know. The Americans compared to the Europeans, for example, are so generous. There is a culture of giving. And you look at these big entrepreneurs in the old days, they were already beginning to give a lot of different things. Just look around America, you will see how much given is done on an hourly basis, a minute basis. The Americans are great givers. And China, because of communism, the Chinese, the doctrine is that from the day you're born, from cradle to grave, the government is supposed to take care of you. That is what it's supposed to do. So when the idea of charity first came, there was a lot of embarrassment from the government's point of view that they are unable to take care of their citizens. It's very interesting, right? Mm-hmm. And now it's very different. Now I've been doing a lot of charities, and especially in the last 20 years, people are changing. People are changing. Of course, I can say that a lot of people are doing auctions at an extraordinary amount of money, for an extraordinary amount of money, because they want the television to be on them, or because they want everybody to know how rich they are. But the same thing happens in America too, right? It sure does. So they are beginning to be giving. They're beginning to understand the value of giving. I think that this is a very good beginning, and I find the Chinese really quite generous. I have no problem doing our charity in China. I mean, every year we do extremely well. Sometimes I have had an incident where Prince Robert of Obrion gave me 2 cases of wine, amazing wines, to auction. Our auction, the success of our auction, the money that we raised with those 2 cases was bigger than Hong Kong.
Wow.
They say have the same 2 cases. So I am very impressed with how generous the Chinese people are these days.
Let me ask you one final question, more kind of for my own edification. You've done so many interviews in your career. What do you think the key is to kind of unprying the person and really opening them up to getting them to reveal who they are? Because you do a fantastic job at it. What's the key to that, do you think?
Ask outrageous questions. Questions that he would never expect you to be asking. I remember one time I interviewed the Prime Minister of Thailand, and I said, people would never expect me to ask such a stupid question. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you are still single. Doesn't your mother get very nervous about you being single? And he just cracked up. It was a funny question, and it started him talking about the fact that he really is very happy being single, blah blah blah. So I think that you have to know them well enough to be able to ask such questions. I think the more personal. Don't you think the more personal it is, the better it is? Yeah. That you find out more about that person.
Yeah, some people don't want to open up, but you've done a great job of it. Thanks so much for coming on the broadcast. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. We'll be right back with this week's Full Frame Close-Up. Stay put. He's known to break every rule of topography and design. Edward Fella is an exceptional graphic designer, artist, and educator. 2 typefaces he created, Out West and Fella, have had a huge influence on contemporary topography. His work can be described as original, idiosyncratic, and authentic. During his commercial art days, Fella rarely used a computer. He preferred handmade compositions. Other designers followed what's known as the Swiss style of graphic design. It was developed in the 1950s, and it emphasized cleanliness and readability. Fella went in another direction, creating something more eccentric and quirky. Now retired, he still influences the art world and encourages artists to keep their work authentic despite what others are doing.
When I worked in the profession, I was pretty conventional. You had to work with the conventions. Right? It had to be appropriate for the audience. I always said design was, you know, permission given and allowance taken. So, you know, from the permission that the culture gave you or the demographics gave you or the necessity gave you, you could take a little bit of allowance and you know, tweak it a bit or twist it a bit. So that's one of the problems with graphic design. So it has these different audiences. If you're doing a manual for a brain surgeon, you want it to be very readable. In fact, as a graphic designer, you try to make it even more readable, right? But then if it's something more radical or experimental or provocative, then you can do these kinds of things. You know, Detroit was at its height back in the 60s and 70s, and you know, it was a major city and a major place for advertising design. So I was a commercial artist or graphic designer in the profession for 30 years, and those were all good years when there was lots of work. The second part of my life was that after 30 years, my kids were grown up, so I decided, well, it's time to retire from that. And then I went to graduate school, and then graduated at the age of 49, and then I got a teaching job here at CalArts. Then I taught here in the graduate program for 25 years, and I retired. And during that career of teaching, I didn't do any more professional work. I just did my personal kind of explorations and my, you know, experimenting. And also I didn't do computer work or digital work, because that was just at the point when I retired when the digital era began, so I never did anything digital other than conceptually. I always say I'm a graphic designer and artist from the last century, the middle of the last century. This body of work, these flyers that I did probably for 30 years, allowed me to play out all these typographic ideas. So I would, if I did a lecture, I would bring a stack of the flyers that I did that were kind of a souvenir piece. It was the same, it was an announcement for the lecture that I just gave. Like even this was an announcement for an exhibition that I had. The gallery was called Red Cat, so instead of, it never says Red Cat on it, it's just this red cat. But then these became kind of my body of work. Then they became, then in a sense they became art, right? Because they never did function as communication. Art is always after the fact. Art starts when it's shown, right? It doesn't exist literally until you show it, then there it is. And then it's there forever, right? It just has a beginning, it has no end. Whereas graphic design has an end. The end is always the event, the communication, the, you know, whatever, the magazine, the newspaper. So these flyers kind of contradicted that. They didn't have to be persuasive, for example. They could just be about typography itself. In 1976, somebody gave me a sketchbook and said, why don't you put all this kind of stuff in a book? And also, it'd be this size. That's when I started the little sketchbooks, the pocket sketchbooks. I have to do with letters. So this is, you can see how many there are. Each page is a finished page. So it's a kind of experimental typography using, and they're carefully done. And some of them have to do with typography, and some have to do with collage and and some are just pure drawing. So that's an example of... Totally, there are now about 139 of these books, and each book has about 100 pages in it, or 80 to 100 pages. It's not like I spent all my time drawing. It looks like it when the years go by. So yeah, younger people sometimes, oh my God, you must do nothing but draw all day long. But no, it's not true. I always tell them, yeah, the factor is time. Time. My reputation is something that just came because I made some work. And I always say, you know, to students, I've always said, you just have to make an undeniable body of work. And then people somehow respond to it. I don't want them to be Ed Fella. I want them to be whoever they are. What I am to people is a model for practice, not a model for the work, right? It's a model on how to make your work, how to think about design and all of that, but not a style or an answer. You have to, or you want to, and people do want to, have their own, right? Nobody wants to copy somebody, really. The visionary business then just becomes, you know, a moment in time, comes and it goes. And I don't know if they're deliberately visionaries, but just because they have a certain idea of what they want to do, they become that. And you know, I always quoted for years, my students, Barnett Newman said, "I paint so I have something to look at." And I think that's the best. You just do it so you have something to do, and then hopefully it will also satisfy you or a larger culture. And if not, then it doesn't. And if it does, then hey, lucky you. But you're still making it because you believe somehow in wanting to do that.
That's it for this week. Join the conversation with us on social media. We are CCTV America on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And now you can watch Full Frame on our new mobile app, available worldwide on any smartphone for free. Get the latest news headlines and connect to us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Weibo. Search CCTV America on your app store to download today. All of our interviews can still be found online at cctv-america.com. And let us know what you'd like us to take Full Frame next. Simply email us at fullframe@cctv-america.com. Until then, I'm Mike Walter in New York City. We'll see you next time.